Welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to just talk about the topic of your choice. This month, Densoro has requested. All right, so this is my fault a little bit. I feel these are very related topics, but I couldn't fit them into one little phrase. Like lightweight tabletop RPGs and games based on other games, which are very frequently hand in hand. We're going to be talking about a game today that is kind of like a lighter rules version of D&D for Destiny, the looter shooter Destiny. It's called Light, and it uses a system called Lumen that the author, this is Gila RPGs, that's as much of a shout out as we're doing in this one, made. So if you want to go check that out, that's where you find that. The Gila is Gila RPGs on itch.io. So if you want to go check that out, that's who that is. Densoro says, there's a TTRPG author, this person, making rules light-ish love letters to Warframe, Destiny, and other looter shooters. Yes, there's a Warframe one too called Nova that I didn't have anything to say about in particular. With builds. So these games are on sale if you want to go find them. They aren't as crunchy as D&D, which Densoro says is a plus for them because they can't seem to roll higher than a 3 on a d20. I don't think that's bad, but I still think there's room for synergy here. Now, I guess what you're implying, Densoro, is you feel like there's less buildcraft hooks. Interesting. Nova is the Warframe analog, but the Destiny one, Light, has mechanics in place for procedural weapon drops that complement the core gameplay. Yes, it's called Vulcan. It's an expansion. Vulcan is the weapon crafter at the lighthouse that you work out of in Light. And they can craft you guns, basically, like with random perks, not dissimilar to Destiny's weapon system, on the surface anyway. All these mechanics were designed to play well together because both games are skins for the author's homebrew system, Lumen, which we will be talking about a little bit. I was wondering if you'd be up for taking a look at the games. Yeah, again, I had the most to say about the Lumen system and the Vulcan part of Light, which is the Destiny one, so I hope that's okay. I have a lot to say in this parlay. We're going to have to take each topic in stride. I want to talk about like games, adapting a game into another game, like games inspired by other games, Destiny, Warframe, but anyway. And I'm going to make a lot of comparisons to Dungeons and Dragons because that's the tabletop RPG I've played. I haven't played any others. I know about a lot of others, like I've read the rules for a lot of others, but full disclosure, I haven't played them. I don't mean to misrepresent the benefits of those other games. However, I'll be honest with you at the beginning of this parlay, I don't have a high opinion of lightweight TTRPGs. And the reason why is that I feel like if you're a person who... The purpose of the rules in D&D is guidance for role-playing. If you don't know them, it's fine. You just need to be willing to improvise. And if you use a rules-light tabletop RPG, you have to improvise more. You just don't have to worry about not knowing the rules, I guess. To me, it's like if you are a person who could use the lightweight ones, you could just play D&D too. You would just not need to confirm that certain things were the rules. When a character falls, you can just not look up how much fall damage they take and think intuitively about what makes sense to you. Other games would simply not have that rule. And I don't think that that actually accomplishes that much. That's my opinion. My very, very limited experience opinion, okay? So I'm going to be upfront about what I think. You'll get to think about that a little bit for yourself, hopefully, during these. But that's not to say, I hope you all know, I'm not the kind of person where I think that and so I immediately think, oh, this game is just pointless, I'm not interested. No, for that very reason, I am very interested. I'm happy that I did parlay, made this a part of my life, so that I'm encouraged to engage with these systems that I, by default anyway, wouldn't have spent time with. I have so many other things in my life I wouldn't have spent time on something like this, but I am interested in it. I'm not the kind of person who thinks badly of a thing and then plugs off of it. Like, I would love to think about it more and have a better opinion about it. I just hadn't until now. So I hope that's clear. Like, that's not bad. I think this is a good thing. It was a pleasant surprise. And this is a really good game for an example, too. It doesn't do a thing that a lot of games do when they kind of react to D&D. A really common thing that's done is a game you'll roll 3d6 instead of rolling a d20. And, 3d6, you could get between a 3 and an 18, which is a lot like rolling a d20, except it's more consistent. Not only is the range a little smaller, but the real reason it's more consistent is there's just more combinations of 3d6 that equal like the middle numbers. Whereas on a d20, you're as likely to get a 1 as a 20. You're more likely to get a consistent result with 3d8. I don't think that 3d6. I don't think that's good. I think it's good to have a lot of variance on the d20 because one, your skill bonuses add that consistency. If I have a +9 in acrobatics and I roll a d20, well, if I get a 1, I got a 10. So seems like I'm pretty consistent. And I'm also capable of these higher numbers, which you can simply rule as overkill. If I want to jump over a little gap, we'll come back to that little gap later, and I roll a 25, it's jumping over a cliffside. Like I don't need a 25. So I get a result that's like, I don't know, if I got a 16, for example, and that's fine. There's no damage done there. It was pretty consistent. I had kind of narrowed the range. I think that D&D already accomplishes that consistency with its systems, or that you shouldn't get that consistency if you're not trained at something. People can do amazing things, but if they have no practice, it's kind of a crapshoot. And I think a d20 relatively accurately simulates that. But that's up for interpretation. Some people use a 20 and a 1 on a d20 as being a critical success or failure no matter what you roll on a skill check. Now, in combat, that is part of D&D's core rules. There are some people that don't do it, but a lot of people do. But for skill checks, it's more variable. Personally, I would recommend considering not doing that sometimes. If the thing being done is very low stakes and the person rolls a natural 1, I don't know, like it just doesn't feel realistic or good to the player to fail outlandishly at some like mundane thing. You might decide that it makes sense. Maybe the players have been traversing a mountain and they've made a ton of like individually low stakes little jumps over things. And having one of those jumps lead to a big consequence, it kind of feels like it would fit the storytelling in that situation. But again, this is something where if you had a lightweight tabletop RPG, you just wouldn't have that as a rule suggestion. And if you would think of it yourself, you just do it anyway. It's not bad that there is a rules framework if you want it. I feel like the critique of D&D having a lot of rules is maybe you're a person who just should ignore those rules. I'm not really talking to you, Densoro. Although if that's useful advice, then that's great. But that's what I think about the lightweight tabletop RPGs. But I want you to think about it for yourself too. Forgive me for putting my cards on the table. So let's quickly talk about how Lumen works. And then we're going to talk about adapting a game into another game, like adapting Destiny into a tabletop RPG, and then the Vulcan system for weapons. I'm going to be comparing that to something about D&D as well. Again, forgive me for the D&D comparisons. That's just the only one I have for reference. I do think these two games make for a good comparison, like an interesting comparison point. And I'll explain why. But anyway, Lumen, yes. So the idea with this system is that it runs off something different than rolling a d20 for your checks. If you're not familiar with tabletop role-playing games at all, this will give you a great example of how that might work. And I'm actually going to translate the example that the author gives into D&D as well, so you see both side by side. So I'm going to read word for word the page on their free, by the way, the SRD document that gives you the basic rules for Lumen and all the games made with it, including Light, which is the Destiny game. Put this up since it's not my text. Lumen uses D6 dice pools with ranges of success as the core mechanic. Every class in the game has 3 attributes, which determine how they attempt things rather than what they are attempting. We'll discuss that more in the classes section, which we won't have time for today. When a character is acting and there's a risk to that action, they roll dice. They roll a pool of d6 equal to that attribute that best describes how they're acting, and they keep the highest result. On a 1 or a 2, the action fails and there's a consequence. On a 3 or a 4, the action succeeds, there's a complication. 5 or a 6, the action succeeds with no problems. So again, the way this system works is you're rolling d6s to determine success, and you roll more of them the higher your attribute for this action is, and you take the highest roll. You ignore the other ones. So it's not like the total number. That's it. That's how 90% of the game works. Great opening line, by the way. Let me show you an example, the author says. Kate is playing as Amp, one of the frames in the Nova game, which is like Warframe, and wants to quickly leap across a catwalk, remember that gap from before, unnoticed, timing it when the guards have their backs turned. It's decided that the action is using flow, a stat in this game, and she has a 3 for flow, so rolls 3d6 and keeps the highest result. She rolled a 2, a 1, and a 4, and the 4 is the highest result, so she gets a 4, a success with a consequence. The GM describes Kate's frame landing on the catwalk and then noticing the guards changing shifts. The heavy boots of approaching soldiers echo off the walls. While a d6 dice pool is not revolutionary in any way, the author concludes, and indeed it's not, that's a very, very common thing, the important thing is that those dice are linked to the 3 attributes. And again, it's critical that unlike other d6 systems, this isn't about averaging the rolls or whatever. You roll more and take only the highest one. Again, maybe it's more complicated if you go further in the rules, which we don't have time for today, but that's the gist of it. Now, I'm going to translate that situation into D&D, and then we can briefly compare them. Again, for people who haven't played D&D, maybe that was simple enough. You get how it would work. Let's say that you tried to heft a boulder out of the way, and that's using some other stat that you don't have a bonus in. You roll 1d6 and take that result, and you get either a 1 or a 2, a 3 or a 4, or a 5 or a 6, and that's your result. Let's say you did the catwalk thing, but in D&D. Well, flow in Lumen, well, in D&D it would probably be dexterity, and you're trying to jump over unnoticed. So probably in this situation, it's sleight of hand or acrobatics. Those are both dexterity skills where you add your, stealth or acrobatics. You could be sleight of hand, but anyway, I'm going to say stealth, which is a dexterity-based skill. This is how well you can control your body to be quiet while you are moving. Dexterity. So in D&D, skills work like this. It's a stealth check, your DM says, I'm saying. You add your relevant ability modifier, whatever your dexterity modifier is, and then if you're proficient at the specific thing, stealth, you also add your proficiency modifier. And then you add that to whatever you roll. So let's say you have a 14 in dexterity, and that gives you a +2 in D&D. That would be right on your character sheet. You don't have to calculate that. So you look at your dexterity, that's +2, and then you see that you've got a check in the stealth box, you're proficient in it. So you add your proficiency bonus. Okay, that's +3, let's say. So you add a +5 to your check. Cool. Now you roll a d20. I rolled a 20. And then I add 5. So I get a 25. Very good. The way I would think of it is like a 10 is very average, unremarkable. Could you do this thing if you were totally unremarkable? A 20 is like, for a normal person, this would be like the most badass thing they do. Could you do this if you did something exceptional? And then again, a 30 is like you're beginning to, it's like a miracle that somebody would do this. How you roll skill checks will vary, but I think it's important to keep them grounded if that's the approach you want to take. You go to 20, 25. I don't believe this action warrants more than maybe a 20, so you deftly leap across the gap. And again, maybe it would be a flavor moment that like, you sure did do that in an impressive way. Maybe an NPC that you're with learns about you, that you're like really dexterous or something from that interaction. So again, if it were Lumen, you would have taken your dexterity modifier, 2, and added 2 more dice to your pool. So you'd roll 3d6 and take the highest one. And that results in consistency, kind of like how it resulted in consistency in D&D. The main difference in my mind is that the variance, like the ability to relatively fail, is kind of higher in D&D. You could have rolled like a 2 and added 5, and then you got a 7, and your character, who is significantly invested in doing this, would be a little bad at it. You know, a 7 is not terrible if it's a minor gap, but probably people would notice. I think that's fine, but it's kind of up to your appetite. Remember, this is possible in Lumen. It's just kind of less likely. Like, you probably won't have your lowest roll of 3d6 be a 2 most of the time, whereas in D&D, you could roll something pretty unremarkable, and you're still getting like a 12 if you're only adding +5. So, I don't know. And then another thing D&D does that's a little awkward, I guess, is you can get way more than what is warranted. Whereas Lumen kind of bounds it, you can only get a 6 at the highest. And so the action, you can't like critical success, you know? Now, I don't think this is really a problem. I think you can just say, like, okay, yeah, you don't get credit for more than a 20, but sometimes you can get credit for more than a 20. You're searching around, and normally you wouldn't be able to find this thing, but the player rolled like a 30. They have a moment of, you can rule it as a DM as like they just got lucky. And so they, as they're searching, they bump a drawer, and it happens to be the drawer where there is like a photograph of, somebody they're investigating or whatever. And it feels a bit hand wavy, but they rolled unnaturally well, so you're being encouraged to improvise luck into the environment, which I like. Again, that role playing prompt could simply be ignored. It's not a negative thing, in my opinion. But anyway, I know you don't really want me to compare this to D&D, but I do, so I hope it's okay. That I'm really interested in that, and I do think the games are interesting comparison points. So that's the kind of core rolling mechanic in Lumen. Forgive me for not going over all the rules that we would definitely not have time. I wanted to focus more on that because I think it's really interesting. Again, please understand, like, I don't think it's a bad way to do that. I like the way that 5th edition does it, and that's why. Some people have been saying, they're going to update 5th edition. There's going to be a 6th edition. What are you going to do about that? I'm going to keep playing the one I like. Who cares? Like, I don't care that the new one will be more popular. I'm just going to play the one I enjoy. A lot of the rules used in Critical Role, which has millions of viewers every time it streams on Twitch, are not really the 5th edition rules that other people use. Critical Role is a pretty rules-light game anyway, actually. You could rule it as a lightweight tabletop RPG. I actually think it's a little weird when they bring rulings from D&D into Critical Role because it doesn't really fit with the way they're playing the game. Anyway, a topic for another time, which I'm deeply interested in. Yes, so now that we've talked about that, though, I want to talk about making a game that is like inspired by another game. So Light and this Vulcan system for making weapons that we're going to talk about, that's made using that Lumen RPG system we talked about, that's based on Destiny. Well, what does that mean? And so I think it's interesting to consider, like, if you were going to make a Warframe themed tabletop RPG, like what? Like how? Because in my opinion, the Warframes are basically analogous to subclasses in Dungeons and Dragons. There's a kind of similar amount of them. And, there's some general categories. There are a couple of frames that are lightning related or electricity related, but they're still specialized. Gyre is meaningfully different from Volt, but they are still both kind of a lightning based frame. So it's not like their design space doesn't overlap at all. Again, very much like subclasses. There are some subclasses that are very similar to another class's subclass, but they are meaningfully different still for a variety of reasons, mechanically or whatever. And so it is in, Warframe. I don't know if Nova, the Lumen RPG that is based on Warframe, is like that, but just to say, I think that Warframe is an example of a game that I would kind of just want to run in 5th edition. Now, some people have said before how, because learning the rules, you remember how I feel about the rules of these games, the rules of these games can be complicated enough that it might be better to kind of jury rig the system you already play. And personally, I like 66% agree with that. I kind of feel like you might have a game that does a thing that, like 5th edition, let's say, really doesn't cater to. The design of the game really doesn't do that thing. Like, personally, I think that rolling a d20 really doesn't do like great heroism. You're gonna see people epic fail at things if you go by what you're rolling on your die. You could adapt the system to not do that, I guess, whatever. But I feel like that rule doesn't seem to be, it's not helping you do that thing. That's what I'm trying to say. A lot of people do play Dungeons and Dragons as a kind of low stakes, we're basically invincible heroes game, which is perfectly fine. I'm simply arguing that D&D doesn't help you do that as much as, like, you could find a game that helped you do that a lot more. Maybe it's not worth it. There's no answer to that question. I'm just saying I do think that exists. Sure. What is the threshold? This is where we're going with this. At which it makes sense for there to be like a new game. you know? I would say that Warframe doesn't have anything that immediately strikes me as like you really need there to be a different game to simulate that. Maybe not every single thing in Warframe, but I don't think that matters from a game design perspective. A tabletop RPG and a looter shooter computer game are not the same thing. They're not. You can't make Warframe be exactly like Warframe as a tabletop RPG, obviously, because there isn't like a screen and a control, like, obviously. So it's a matter of how you're adapting it. What are you adapting? You see what I'm trying to say? It might make sense not to put mods on weapons in Warframe. In Warframe, when you play Warframe, picking individual mods for each weapon isn't often that meaningful. A lot of the time, you run the multipliers, the crit, the status, the base damage, the viral, and like that's what you run. Having every individual mod be a game mechanic in a Warframe tabletop RPG would be needlessly complicated. It wouldn't actually replicate the feeling of playing Warframe, because that isn't a meaningful part of the feeling of playing Warframe, in my opinion. And it would be complicated for like not much of a gameplay gain. It would make the game feel more like it was Warframe, but Warframe is a free-to-play game that is available on all platforms. You don't need it to feel exactly like Warframe. You're trying to capture like the essence of the thing. And I don't think that there's anything in Warframe's essence that feels unlike Warframe. Is a lot like D&D in my opinion, in some way. Destiny though, the Vulcan system is a thing that I think like 5th edition doesn't really do very well. You could do it. You could always do it. You could add this to 5th edition. But does it make sense to have like Destiny is a game where your build is in principle very simple, and then your weapons, there's like a lot of relative complexity compared to the rest of the game. So making a game using a system where it's front loaded pretty simple, but then the weapon mechanics are like relatively more involved does make some sense. Again, like whether it's worth doing, there's really no answer there. But I get why you would do that. You see what I'm trying to say? And I do think that Lumen and then this Vulcan system I'm about to describe to you, they do match that. They match the relative simplicity and focus on the gameplay loop rather than like the, I guess, nuts and bolts buildcraft thing that Destiny has on the surface, at least in my experience of Destiny, which is limited. Okay. Not trying to tell anyone how Destiny is for them. We're using it as an example. And then the gun system is complicated. So something I want to come back to, you can think about as we talk about this. I'm going to describe this Vulcan system to you, how it generates weapons, how weapons work in this game. But something we're going to come back to is how this kind of mirrors, is kind of the reverse of, I think, the worst thing about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. When you play for the first time, you get a character sheet, and if you make a character, DMs don't do this with your players, but a lot, like probably most people do this when they play the first time, or their first, like, I guess, real time. Maybe the very first time they touch D&D, they get given a character. But when they play their first campaign, they plan them out. You have to make a ton of decisions on your character sheet. Almost all of the decisions you will ever make about your character, for most classes anyway, before you have played the game and know the significance of any of those things. Now, if you're me, then you're a DM who will generate really understanding interpretations of what your player picks. If my player picked investigation, and to me, what they meant was insight, like I'll just let them swap to insight, swap their proficiency to insight, or like maybe I could change how I interpret investigation a little bit. Big deal. But a lot of tables really don't do that. They're just not I'm not trying to brag about myself. They're not flexible. They don't do that thing. I am bragging about myself, whatever. I realized before I realized that I was bragging about myself. But my point is that you make a lot of those decisions up front. Now, narratively, or from like a structure perspective, a lot of entertainment, media, stories, movies, books, games, use the beginning of the thing to kind of cash in the audience's patience to do the thing. You know, the audience has bought the game or come to the game night or sat down at the movie or whatever, and so they've got a little bit of patience left. So cash that into the beginning to get whatever exposition you need done. And in D&D, that's making your character sheet. That's how I think of it. Lumen doesn't do this, in my estimation. Instead, that's later. The complicated or fiddly bit, not saying that's negative, but the part that would cost that resource mentally is later when you make guns. But I'm not sure that it seems like a really bad thing about D&D, but I kind of feel like asking for that early on is good. I don't know. So anyway, we'll read it and you could decide for yourself. But it's interesting because 5th edition has a big table of weapons with different properties that looks a lot like this Vulcan system table, which I'm not going to show you because it is, like you can go look it up for yourself. I'm not going to plug everything about this game. It would take a lot of time. But yeah, this table looks a lot like the 5th edition weapons table, but a lot of the qualities on the weapons on this table matter a lot, whereas in the 5th edition weapons table, they really don't. You don't actually need to know them. They look very similar. This is much more complicated. Not necessarily complicated. I like me a complicated game sometimes, but anyway, what do you do? So Vulcan is a character in your lighthouse that you live in. He's your gunsmith. And this person will craft you weapons based on you doing bounties. So these are like in Warframe bounties, kind of, or Destiny, kind of achievements. Get a number of kills with a weapon type. Use a variety of killing methods in a single strike, kind of the missions or mini campaigns in this system. Get a certain number of headshot kills, etc. You get the idea. Could be a lot of stuff. And then you get a favor, and you can cash in favors to get new weapons. One favor would get you like replacing a weapon tag, like an ability, or adding a random weapon tag, an ability. We'll talk about them in a minute. 2 favors would get you a randomly generated weapon, or you could remove all tags and replace them with random tags. So you can modify your weapons that way. And 3 favors gets you a custom-made weapon. You can choose the weapon type and 2 additional tags of your choice. Pretty powerful. I think there's some incentive to save them up. Okay, guns. And so how do you make one? Well, let's do it. I've got some D6s right here. So we're going to determine weapon type. We roll 2d6, and that's going to tell us what type of weapon it is. There's a table. We figure out what type of weapon. Okay, so I rolled a 6 and a 4. So a 6 and then a 4 is an LMG, a light machine gun. Of course, it goes without saying that you would need to know what these things were, but this is intended for people who've played this kind of game already. So anyway, a light machine gun. Cool. I love the Spitfire in Apex Legends, which you might rule as being this type of weapon or not, but I don't know why I like that weapon so much. It's not maybe that great, but anyway, I really like it. I also really like the Rampage, where you put the thermite grenade in. Anyway, I like LMGs. Cool. After determining the weapon type, roll a d6, okay? I got a 3. If you roll a 5 or a 6, nope. The weapon comes with an additional tag chosen from the list or randomly determined. Oh, okay, cool. So your weapon can randomly get a little bit better, like better quality. This is like a loot drop, right? Okay, number 2, determine additional tags. Did that? Nope. Number 3, give it a name and describe it. Okay, what qualities do LMGs have? Let's see. Okay, so they do 1 harm. They do 1 damage when you attack with them. They're close to medium range, and they have spin up. What does that do? It does additional damage the longer it's focused on the same target. I suppose you need to decide how much. Maybe it does 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. Is that OP? Depends how long your combats last. Something if I'm understanding correctly, you're meant to decide. This rule set leaves that open-ended. Again, I'm not trying to say that that's a bad thing. I'm just trying to say that if there were rules for what that did, you could ignore those rules. Like you don't have to use, like if D&D had light machine gun rules, which it doesn't, to my knowledge, you're not required to use them. It'd be interesting to think about what would be a good way for this to work in D&D. I agree that having the numbers be so flat makes it much easier to balance. In D&D, I'm thinking like, okay, well, you usually use a die for damage. And why? Well, because it's fun to roll dice. But that does make it more complicated. So like a greatsword does 2d6 in D&D, and a dagger does 1d4. Okay, so what if your light machine gun does 1d6 every round, 1d6 more damage every round, 1d6, then 2d6, then 3d6. It's pretty bad for probably a two-handed weapon, is what I would flavor it as, the first round. Then it's a great sword at range, the second round. That's good, but you did have to really tank your damage the first round. And then 3d6 is insane. Maybe it stops spooling up at that point. You could kind of interpret that freely yourself. You could say it overheats or something. I'd like to stop here to make another point. Something that's true of all TTRPGs is that if you're gonna do this kind of open-ended interpretation and storytelling, the thing about these games is I feel like you need to be, I'm not trying to say you all aren't, but like relatively, I'm gonna say mature to play these games this way. You, the player, you need to really trust your DM to interpret things in good faith, to try to make things balanced, to make an effort to make things good, but not overpowered, like not safe. You want your DM to want you to have an exciting time. So they're not going to try to make something safe on power level. They're going to try to make it a little pushed, but not just broken, because otherwise it's like you didn't earn it, right? That requires a lot of skill from the DM and also a lot of trust from the player that I'm just going to say, I don't think 90% of the people playing TTRPGs have those things. Like, no offense at all. It's hard. I'm not trying to say I don't know if I have those things. But it's very difficult. That's what I'm trying to say. That would be the place where falling back on rules would be beneficial. I know I'm really over critiquing lightweight TTRPGs. This is not so people don't play them. It's so people that will enjoy them will play them. That's all I'm trying to say. Does that make sense? Like, I think this is really interesting. I like the idea of, like, that's so elegant, right? It's 1 damage, and you could just have it, like, doop up, points of damage. Is that OP? I haven't played this game, I don't know. Let's look at the other weapons. We could get some idea. Sniper rifles do 3 harm, and they have the far and stationary properties. They're effective from far away. What's stationary do? Must be still for a short period in order to use. Okay, yeah, again, and so it'd be up to your game master's discretion, how long you need to be still for. So that does 3, but it's got that disadvantage. Interesting. Okay, so it seems kind of fair if your LMG does 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then, like that. Interesting. Okay. Maybe it could even spool up by more. I don't know. Anyway, cool. All right. So what if we made something OP? We save up 3 favor, and we get to pick what kind of weapon we get, and we get to pick any 2 tags. Is that right? Okay, cool. So we're picking that. There is a lot. The point I was trying to make before about the weapon table thing is that here there's maybe 24 properties, and it's not that they're mechanically complicated, but you need to know what they do off the top of your head, or they don't, I guess it's intuitive, you could say. And you could just interpret what they are. Again, you can always bypass the rules, but there are a lot of rules in this section. I reckon that very few players will gain a working understanding of what all of these things do quickly. You will need to reference this table a lot. In D&D, you don't have that. As long as you know your weapon's damage die, you're kind of good in that regard. And D&D has a lot of weapons, which is weird, right? They really only accomplish giving you different flavor suggestions. They're not actually mechanically different. I don't think that's bad. I think D&D does that because it wants them to be simple, not because it couldn't think of. Sometimes I've seen interesting interpretations of what abilities weapons should have in D&D, like what a dagger should have as its abilities or something, which really isn't the point of 5th edition. It's purposefully does not have those things. It's not because they couldn't think of any or something, right? It's because they made a game design decision that it's not better with those things. Now here, it's kind of different. We have a system that isn't loading that complexity elsewhere. So if the experience of Destiny is uniquely having this somewhat involved weapon, maybe that's good. Maybe that's cool, Do I remove... Oh, choose the weapon type and 2 additional tags on top of what the weapon already has. Okay, wow, this is going to be spicy. All right, let's try. But you can see that complexity is the game has taken its sort of economy of complexity and put it over here. A decision you could make. But that's a very different not really better or worse, not really more simple, in my opinion, decision than doing it the way D&D does it. In my opinion, I really feel like that's just redistributing the complexity. Do you want weapons to be simple and maybe spells and uh I guess like skill checks to be a little bit more intricate, to have a little bit more rules referencing, or do you want that to be on the weapons? Like, again, a decision you could make, but I don't feel that's actually less complicated. It's just complicated in a place that gives you the feeling of playing Destiny more, which is cool. Like, that's cool. Um, I want, so we get the base modifiers on a weapon, and that means I'm going to pick one that I think is okay. So a rocket launcher does 4 damage, medium range, reload, AoE. What does reload say? This weapon occasionally requires time spent reloading. I would rule after every shot. It does 4 damage in an AoE. Affects multiple targets of what? Yeah, it's rocket launcher. Are there any things we can add to this that would be really really powerful? Let's see. Um, ooh, backup clip only on reload weapons. You don't have to reload as often. Very nice. You could fire 2 shots before reloading, maybe. We got anything? So that's one additional modifier. Anything we could add that would give me like some kind of bonus to Spin Up says does additional damage the longer it's focused on the same target. I wonder if we could flavor it as like a homing rocket launcher, and you spend a turn locking on, and then if you get a direct hit, it does like 6 damage instead of 4. That could be spicy, and then you can do that twice in a row. Once you're locked on, you get dumph dumph, and then you have to reload. 2 shots in a row, and they do 6 if you take 1 round to lock on first. And then you got, instead of doing 4 damage, 4 damage, and then reloading, you did a turn of locking on, 6 damage, 6 damage, and then you reload. So over time, it's about as efficient, but you use less ammo. Does that matter in this game? You could rule whether it does or not. Interesting. Okay, cool. Let's see. Any other ones that stick out to me? Spray can hit multiple targets within effective range is kind of the same as AoE. It's meant to be like an SMG. You spray through a group of enemies. I'm imagining like a cone of damage, but you could flavor that to be the rocket launcher has like shrapnel rounds or something, or like little bomblets that come out of it. Lots of Warframe weapons have this. I've always liked those. That could be cool. And you could flavor it like that. You can see how these traits are, again, kind of the purpose of all these things is like a role-playing prompt, I would argue. You can see how imagining a weapon that has the the scoped or focused or whatever the other one I was looking at, that property, you can see how thinking about a rocket launcher that has that property makes you think, oh, like a homing missile. And then if it was like a spray weapon, I'm not sure how you'd rule that in terms of gameplay, but it's like, oh, like bomblets or like shrapnel or something. And you can see how that would lead to flavor. Erupt. Enemies killed with this weapon explode in the element used. Sure, yeah, you can imagine like a kind of a cluster bomb, or like it explodes on the enemies and then it douses them in gasoline or something and then they ignite or whatever. Cool, badass. And these kind of prompt those role-playing ideas. So, I without playing the game, it would not be meaningful to make like there wouldn't really even be a full build. The context of what that build would do would be entirely defined by your game master's rulings. So there isn't really a lot else I can say in terms of like, we can't actually make a build as per se. We could just sort of brainstorm, what would it be like? Would you make some kind of intricate fit with your chosen class? Absolutely, yes. The thing I think is like both interesting and also kind of weird about build crafting in tabletop role-playing games, something I do a lot that I really love. The way I DM is most of my NPCs are built using character sheets, like using player character settings, because my campaign takes place where a bunch of mercenaries are on a gold rush treasure hunt to go find this national treasure of a local seaside trading nation. And they say that there's this ancient relic that they discovered, that they heard word of or whatever, their wizard saw with scrying magic, and you're supposed to go get it in exchange for fabulous wealth and treasure. So not all of the people in my campaign are like skilled adventurers, like powerful people, but many more of them than average are. And when my players fight enemies, much more often than in a lot of other people's campaigns, they fight like a player character. Now, of course, I've made these to be matched with the players. In D&D, players are not really balanced for PvP very well. So, of course, I've chosen player characters, builds that inspired me to fight against my players with. And I have a very good working knowledge of those features, so it's extremely easy for me to run them quickly. Like, if you said, like, it's a level 12 monk, I would know all of those features, all the dice, all the damage. I could just make the character sheet in my head right now in like 5 seconds. And then you said, what's the bonus to hit? I'd say +9 to +11. We'll say +9. And then, they get flurry of blows how many times? 7. And then, they have these other features. And I know that stuff, So that's a way that's suited to my DMing style. But the point I'm trying to make is that I love making those character builds, and I have a very high working knowledge of those things, but they don't mean anything outside the context of like the story that we're telling. The power level of the build kind of doesn't exist, which I think is kind of good. That's something I think is sort of the secret of build crafting games. If the game is, I think, a good game for making builds in, the power level of the build should cease to matter as much as possible. If you do something that is sensible, it should have an adequate power level. And then the question is, what does it do, basically? What is the unique gameplay experience the player has made for themselves? And I like this system, this Vulcan thing we're talking about, because it seems to do that. It isn't concerned with how strong the weapon is, because that shouldn't matter. Build crafting is not about that, in my opinion. Games that encourage you to build for the most damage are arguably not games with meaningful build craft. If there is something that is just the most damage, and the game is set up in a way where that matters a lot, the game asks you for that or you die. Again, you might think it matters a lot in a game like Warframe, but if you don't do it, you don't lose the mission, so it doesn't matter a lot. It can matter to you a lot, but the game doesn't force you to choose that. You see what I'm saying? You don't lose the game if you don't pick it. There's lots of raids in Destiny where if you don't pick things that do the damage, you lose. Like, you lose the raid. So it does matter, again, in some kind of objectifiable way. But you can design a game for that to matter or not. And I like this system because in theory, it has the kind of buildcraft hallmark where it's designed assuming that the amount of damage these things do is reasonable, whatever that is, whatever that means. And that there's an acceptable trade-off for doing so. With your homing rocket launcher, the damage isn't that amazing, it looks like, compared to other options, and starts up slower, unless you have a group of targets in an area, and it's okay to fire a huge rocket out of your weapon, and all that stuff, right? Like, it has to fit the situation. I'm imagining you have to crouch down, hold your, big-ass weapon, and, shoot these huge rockets at people. And that's got some consequences, but if it was okay, if you could carry around the ammo too, maybe you could get very limited ammo for a whole mission, you would do the big bongo damage. And we're just kind of assuming that that's fair. Like, in the situation where the rocket launcher shines, a ton of little grunts go flying into the air because you shot your big rocket, and then you're carrying a second weapon. In the guidance for this game, they recommend at least 2 weapons. You could carry more, but there might be some encumberment. So you're going to take like an auto rifle or something with you, with your rocket launcher. I don't know, something like that. Or a sniper rifle for the boss. Hit him in the weak point. I don't know, but that kind of thing. And this system focuses on like not relying on how much damage the things do, which again, I would argue is kind of it's kind of a pedestrian form of buildcraft that most games that offer meaningful choices have. It's sort of like not the point. The buildcraft is there as a way for you to choose a game experience or a playstyle that you like. And when these games ask you for some level of competent damage, Warframe does this, you can't do like no damage. There's just many, many things that do adequate damage, even if some things do much more that you don't need but still benefit from. Warframe gives you that damage modifier. I think of it as just like the net is up when playing tennis. You can't do anything and succeed. There's some, general parameter on, like, you can't just pick literally anything and it will work. You have to pick something that is like good in some way or interesting in some way. But then the game is hopefully balanced in a way where those things are adequately powerful. You've like done a cool thing, and then you get some unique experience in exchange. I think that is, in a nutshell, like what a build crafting game is, and it feels like this system kind of does that. It sounds cool. I'm not sure. Was this a good way to tackle this parlay? You'll let me know. Densoro, you are new to parlay, so if you don't like the way that I did this one, and there's a way I could do it better, please let me know. Thank you for being a parlay patron. I appreciate the support. I'm looking forward to your future parlays. I hope you enjoyed this one. I thought it was fun. Yeah, this system is cool. I like these weapon perks. I like the idea of these. And you could, something I didn't get into is like, you could get into magic items in D&D and how they just sort of are in practice, like complicated like this. Generally, they have an ability kind of like these abilities. They have a list of legendary weapons below, which have, again, like similarly depthy perks, often not too complicated, sometimes a little more complicated, like healing you a little bit when you kill an enemy with the weapon, or chaining the enemy to you when you roll a 6 for damage with it, for hitting with it, stuff like that. Which is interesting. Again, you could argue a lot like a magic item in D&D. I just think it's really interesting to compare where the games put their complexity. I hope you didn't see it as being overly critical or at all dismissive. I think that's really interesting, and I think it makes perfect sense to use one or the other system for certain things. I'm not trying to tell anyone that they're using the wrong system for a thing either. I did say this before, but I really want to drive the point home that, it's a balancing act. How much do you like learning new games? How much does your group like falling back on certain core rules? How much do you want a game that like literally is every single part of another game versus just the experience of a game? All of these things have no answers. You just have to decide for yourself. To me, it doesn't really feel like there's a point in making like a new system for Warframe, because I feel like 5th edition has the elements to simulate what I consider to be the sort of core experience of Warframe. But I can see how it kind of doesn't for Destiny. And so this is a system that does that. To me, that makes sense. There's no correct answer to that, right? Like, you're not like wrong if you don't think that or something. I can't possibly be wrong or right about how I think about that either. It's true that maybe if I played both systems, I would feel differently. We can't really know that. No one has time to know that. So again, that doesn't matter. I'm only saying this so you know that I really don't care about that at all. And I really don't think anybody else should either. I think if somebody were to say, you're using the wrong system for that, like, that means something that isn't practically usable. Like, sure, but not in a way that matters. Like, you can't do anything with that information, is what I'm trying to say. So I think you should just play whatever you find interesting. And if you want to try a new game, you should just enjoy it. That being said, I do think it's really interesting, like, what it might accomplish to make a certain system for a certain game. I hope I did a good job talking about that during this parlay. Thanks for the question. Looking forward to the next one.